Hi, my name is Rosa Abraham. I'm a faculty at Azim Premji University and a part of the Center for Sustainable Employment. I'm very happy to talk to you about the State of Working India report. The theme for this year's report, as Amit mentioned, was on social identities and labour market outcomes. And I want to talk you through what we have done in the report with regard to women and women in the workforce in India. One of the starkest phenomena in the Indian labour market has been a declining trend in women's employment rate over time. So, for example, in 2004, about 40% of working age women were employed in rural areas and about 20% in urban areas. More than a decade later, around 2017-18, this had significantly slowed down and only about 20% of women in rural areas were employed, and in urban areas it had also fallen by around 17%. In this year's State of Working India report, we try and unpack what could be explaining this phenomenon in women's employment rate. One is the nature of structural change in the labour market. So, as the agricultural sector contracted, for men, this meant an exit from agriculture and a movement into construction and services industries. But for women, the exit from agriculture was not matched by a movement into other kinds of jobs. On the one hand, this could reflect a choice that as household incomes increased when husbands' earnings went up, women had a choice to not engage in manual, drudgerous and often precarious employment. And so they exited the labour market. For instance, in this year's State of Working India report, we find that as husbands' earnings increase, this is associated with a declining probability of women to be in employment. However, we find that interestingly, beyond a certain level of husbands' earnings at around 40,000, the increase in husbands' earnings is associated with an increased likelihood of women being in employment. So something like a U-shaped phenomenon really. So the decisions around whether women are employed or not is really often not a decision made by the woman herself, but rather it's made in conjunction with the family and the larger social contexts. So norms really come into play in whether women are employed or not, as well as the kind of work that they get to do. For example, we find in the State of Working India report that the presence of a mother-in-law has a close relationship with women's employment decisions. So compared to a household where there's no mother-in-law, women are less likely to be employed when the mother-in-law herself is not employed. But contrast this with a household where the mother-in-law is employed, then women are more likely to be employed themselves, which speaks to some relaxation of norms when another adult female is employed, as well as perhaps a need to supplement family budgets, which means that both adult women in the household are engaged in paid employment. Another important and perhaps less studied aspect that crucially impacts women's employment is the public infrastructure around her. So we find that when women do work outside the home, which is actually a very low share of women, they tend to be working at closed radiuses around the house. And when they are working outside the home, the major mode of transport for them is really walking by foot, which means that these kind of mobility constraints can also affect the decisions on where women choose to work and what kind of work they do. Further, we find that as distances to work increase, women tend to rely on public transportation far more than men. So for men, as distances to work increase, they move to the use of motorized vehicles, whereas women rely largely on public infrastructure like bus services. This also points towards the crucial role of a larger supporting infrastructure that has to facilitate women's employment in the labour market, especially her employment outside the home, which has a far more empowering impact for women in terms of moving beyond just enabling her to work, but also enabling her to expand her networks as well. Finally, another interesting phenomenon that we note in this year's report has been an increasing trend in women in salaried employment. So although the share of women in employment has steadily declined, one positive aspect is that the women in regular salaried work, which is in a sense the best kind of job, has actually increased over time. So in 2004, out of the women who were employed, only about 10% had regular salaried employment. But by 2019, this share had increased to about 25%. Moreover, in the salaried work generation that has happened between 2004 and 2021, a lot of salaried work has actually gone far more to women compared to men. However, it remains to be said that the kind of salaried work also is varied. So for women, access to really formal salaried work, which has paid leave, which has social security benefits, is still quite constrained. And so in that sense, even though they have been able to secure salaried work, good salaried work which comes with assured pay and a certain security of employment still remains fairly elusive. However, it is also heartening to note that over the years, the earnings gap between men and women have actually narrowed over time. So earlier on, women used to earn about what 70% of men have earned. And more recently, this gap has narrowed, and now they earn about 76% of what men earn.